thanks. I'm going to hit on many of the themes that we've heard about this morning. I'd like to take a little different tack than some of the topics we've talked about and highlight a few issues that I think are core to the integrity, credibility, and reliability of scholarly publishing and their use, but often I think are a little bit below the radar, and in some ways I think not that I want to say that all the aspects of fraud are not critically and important for all of those, but I think that these issues get at the whole of scholarly publishing, and I particularly think they're important because I think societies are in a particular advantageous or necessary position to address some of them. So as a start, let me just kind of remind us all of what scientific publishing is and does. The first four kind of major functions: provide an official archive of scientific progress, major source of communication of science to the public, primary basis for evaluation of scientists, etc., and a major source of income for societies. Have been around for at least the last century. Some of these go back to the fifth one, increasingly important and codified in legal, regulatory, and political decisions, is something that's really emerged over the last 20 or 30 years. I'm not to say that this didn't happen before, but I like to emphasize this one. It's scholarly publishing isn't just for the scientific community. It's got critical functions in our society. We see that every day in policy issues. We saw it in emergency response, such as for Sandy, et cetera. And even things like during SARS, during the Gulf Coast oil spill, the scientific community wanted to publish very quickly in the peer-reviewed literature. I felt that was an important part of even in kind of emergency response scenarios. So, you know, all of this on the credibility of the science scholarly literature, I think we have a responsibility to get this right, to show leadership here for our society responsibilities as well as their scientific ones. And I think it's something that society is increasingly looking at and criticizing the scientific community for not doing right. Okay, so the three things I want to talk about are authorship, data, and open access. In my experience, most of my kind of ethical headaches, I would say 80 to 90%, dealt with authorship. There's a whole variety of aspects of this that come up. It was interesting listening to David's talk and the question he asked about how many of us had seen Feynman's dictum of exploring things that counter your hypothesis in literature. One of our favorites to see was kind of what we call the schizophrenic author, where we get two papers submitted to the journal with one co-author submitting data to both of them that reached entirely opposite conclusions. So sometimes it's done, but often not in the same paper. It's sometimes done in parallel papers. That was some of our more fun ones. A couple things I want to talk about is kind of on the overall responsibility of authorships. I think the nature of what an author is in a scientific paper is changing. Those relationships are changing as the number of authors and international and collaborations grow, as the complexity of science papers goes, and I don't think we've kind of caught up with that. As an example, when I was at Science, and in part to head off of this, we started asking around 2005 every author on a paper whether they agreed to be included as an author on the paper. Here's some of the responses we've gotten. Basically, that's the gist of that text is, are you an author? Please tell us if you're not. Here's some responses we got. I had indicated that it was not necessary to include me as an author. I cannot approve of this paper as I have not read it and I did not know of its existence. Can you please send me a copy? We like that one. Please remove my name. I did not approve this. I had serious issues with the prior version, which were not addressed in the present version. I've transmitted some concerns about this to my lawyer. And, you know, this is funny, but really this is fraud. It's defrauding someone. What was very disturbing about this is when we implemented it was the rate of occurrence. We were getting about one of these a week, or about 0.5%. AGU's been doing this also. I was very glad to see when I got to AGU that they've been doing the same thing for quite a while. The response rate, or the the negative response rate is less at AGU, but since I've been there, I would say that, again, most of my headaches have been around authorship. We just got one of these last week, in fact, where the answer was, I'm consulting my lawyer. I think there's several reasons it's been less. One, it's cultural. I think it's also the average number of authors on a paper are a little less at AGU publications than they were at science publications or science submissions. So that's just one example. There's a whole bunch of other kind of authorship interrelations examples that I can talk about. But I think by the time a paper is submitted, it's often too late. Some of the authorship problems have already started. One example, I'll tell you one other story that is related to some behavior we had recently, where a group of authors submitted a paper, then had it withdrawn, and had a falling out, and then one of the authors on the group decided to submit a paper somewhere else without telling his other authors, and the other authors decided to resubmit their paper without telling the original first author who was removed from the paper. So, in some cases, how to behave as an author as part of a collaboration is something that I think societies can help do, because it needs to be brought up at a level before or at a time when those author collaborations are starting, not when you're finally publication. So the next thing I would like to talk about is data. When you go back and look at the credibility or reliability of literature, in many ways it's not fraud that affects the whole field. It's issues of access to the publications and data in particular. And it's clinically, for example, as at its core, was really an issue about data access, or in many ways that's how it started. And in some ways, if you look at respect for fields, the biomedical fields where I think fraud has been most prevalent has had the lowest respect, whereas things like climate science, which has had very few actual pure ethical problems, has in some ways the lowest regard. A major challenge with data right now is that we're collecting a lot more than we can store and save. And so as a society, we've kind of made kind of organic or default decisions about what data we keep and what standards are used to assess what we keep without really some guidance or standards. For example, most raw genomic data is thrown away these days. In physics, most of the data for the Higgs boson detection are gone. That was a decision they made. They were just collecting way too much data to be able to keep most of that data. A couple of examples. So as this gap widens, as societies, we're going to have to decide what data are researchers required to keep and what are they not, or where do we report kind of highly processed data versus raw data. The second is access to data. This is a report that the EU commissioned and just came out last month. Two reports, one on open access in the literature, and found out through 2000 to 2011, about half the literature is publicly available or openly available now, but only a small fraction of the data associated with that literature are available. So they had some other observations. Few institutions have a data access policy. Few repositories are indexed. Anyway, and I mentioned much less prevalent than open access to papers. When I was at Science, we did a similar survey of the peer reviewers that we used for the previous 6 months. This was in 2011. And if you can't read the small print, basically it was 1,800 peer reviewers, and about 1,400 of them responded that there is no access, that they had, no funding dedicated to data archiving and curation. I don't know that that's really changed in 2 years. Similarly, most of them were only storing data on their labs or computer disks. So as soon as the postdoc left, data. Some societies, I think, have been taking backward steps in addressing this issue. This is the Journal of Neuroscience, and in 2010, they actually decided that they would no longer take data supplements. They were going to rely on authors, like the postdoc, archiving data on their own local hard drives. Since 2010, for example, the Supreme Court has been involved in a couple very major decisions using neuroscience data and citing Journal of Neuroscience data in those decisions. Just an example of the connection between key society policy and journal policy and societal relevance. Okay. Many, as Alan and others have mentioned, many organizations, government organizations, are now emphasizing open data. I think the reality is taking these aspirations and really making them work. And to do that, I think societies have to be involved. As I mentioned, NSF, OECD are requiring open data policies. We need long-term databases. We need long-term efforts on collection of data, which is another problem. And I think societies here have a key role to play because their role in journals and their role in helping set broad standards and practices. Let me just briefly mention open access issues. Open access is growing. Many societies are starting one. HU just started an open access journal, which is actually our second. There's a key additional conflict of interest in this publishing model that is different from the usual subscription model. And this is a financial conflict of interest, and I think this has also gone a little bit below the radar. There's been some recent discussion on some of the discussion sites of this conflict of interest. And this is that, this is just a generic price curve for an open access journal. Basically, it costs more the more selective you are, because you have to reject more papers and there's a higher editorial cost. So Nature, for example, estimates that their open access fee would be about $30,000. What this means is that you can make money by accepting more papers. PLOS One is now, PLOS and PLOS One is the now largest journal in the world. It's also an open access journal. They try to address this by saying editors and reviewers have no access to author payment information, or that the editors are paid a fixed salary and thus aren't paid on commission. That, of course, doesn't really address the conflict. Neither of those really address the conflict of interest, which is, and also any smart editor has a pretty good idea of what an author can pay a fee on. At the recent Council of Science Editors meeting, the main PLOS editor said in his talk that they have to be careful not to reject too many papers with their editors not. That's a quote from the Council of Science Editors meeting. So just of how I think we have not really addressed this conflict of interest. As someone mentioned earlier, there's a whole variety of predatory open access scholarly publishers emerging. These are in the many hundreds now that are soliciting authors to basically publish their papers and make money off them. They've accepted complete nonsense papers. And just to show you how bad this can get, this is kind of a little bit to the aside, but it was revealed in an Australian court case and a subpoena through that case that Merck had paid Elsevier to publish, actually this is one, there's actually ended up being, through further discovery, 6 fake journals run by fake editorial boards that were promoting Merck products and were distributed to your doctors. So I think in particular here, societies have a very prominent role to play because societies in particular can have a process that is or should be as transparent as possible in the oversight of their publications, through publications committees, through involving the councils and boards of those societies, and so forth. So I think this financial conflict of interest is here. Open access is growing. We're embracing it. There's other good reasons to do open access. The community wants it, but we need to do it right, and societies have a very key role to play in ensuring the integrity of this process. So that's all I want to say. Thanks.